The top 1% held over 30% of total U.S. wealth in 2021, while the bottom half of the population owned only 2.5%. That's according to a report of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and the gap seems to be widening. Why such extreme inequality? We were bringing you another episode of our special series on America's three big society woes, and I was pleased to be joined by Benjamin Norton, founder and editor of Multipolarista from Nicaragua, and by David Blair, vice president of the Center for China and Globalization, joining me from southwest China's Tibet Autonomous Region. Mr. Blair, let me go to you first. By the end of 2021, as I mentioned, the top 1% of Americans held a record 32%, or one-third of U.S. wealth. That's almost the same share of the total wealth owned by the bottom 90%. Help us understand how big their collective assets or wealth are versus how small this group is.
Well, obviously, it's a very large number of assets they control. I think even more importantly is that they are beginning, or have for quite a while now actually, use those assets to achieve political power and to continue to increase their wealth. I think there's a number that's actually more telling than looking at the percentage of wealth held. It's the change in average median wages. In the United States, there has been no increase in median real wages since 1979. That means working people have not gotten any increase in their income for more than 40 years. And in the last year, real wages have gone down almost 5%, which means they got poorer in the last year because inflation went up a lot faster than their wages went up. What really happened is you had a transfer of wealth from labor to capital. When I was in graduate school more than 40 years ago, the percentage of the national GDP that went to labor was standard. It was about 65% of GDP. And you use that in a lot of equations, and we just plugged it in, assuming it was fixed. But now it's gone down to about 57% of GDP. The percentage of capital the percentage of wealth, percentage of income going to capital has increased by 8 percentage points of GDP over the last 40 years. GDP's gone up a lot, but it hasn't gone to laborers. It's gone to capital owners. And that's because of policy decisions. It's not an accident of nature. It's because of policy decisions about the financial system, about the Fed having very low interest rates for very many years, which increase the wealth of already wealthy people and make it harder for poorer people. And also because the government's refused to enforce antitrust laws, which led to especially concentration in many types of industry, especially in Silicon Valley and in the banking industry in Wall Street. So people who previously owned small businesses no longer have good access to capital, whereas very big businesses have access to very cheap, basically free capital, for zero interest rate capital.
Actually, according to Pew Research, the rich are getting richer faster in the United States. I don't want to bombard our audience with numbers. Anybody can go up there and see the exact data and the scale. So, Benjamin, what accounted for that phenomenon? Is there any effective measure or mechanism to check the widening inequality in the United States?
Well, I think as Mr. Blair correctly stated here, this is a policy decision that was made by the government. And unfortunately, it's largely bipartisan among both parties. We have seen that the Joe Biden administration has done some lip service to the idea of potentially a capital gains tax, but we've seen that even the Democratic Party has been unable to pass any of this legislation. There are people like Joe Manchin who have said that they would, this bill would potentially dead on arrival. So we have to understand that this is the product of a system that is organized in this way. And it's also the product of an economy that is organized in a way in which more and more working people are trapped in unpayable debt And it really is a system of redistribution from the bottom to the top. My generation, people under 40, are trapped in over 1 trillion, nearly $2 trillion in student debt. We've seen that in the past several decades, higher education in the United States has become increasingly unaffordable. I have many friends and colleagues who have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from graduate studies. And we've also seen household debt has skyrocketed. Mortgages have increased, car payment loans. The economist Michael Hudson has often pointed out that where we're seeing now inflation in the consumer price index, which is hurting a lot of people because of high prices of gasoline and food and products. Well, the reality is there actually has been a lot of inflation in the past several decades, but most of that inflation was in the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. So because it wasn't in the consumer sector and the products that we consume on a daily basis, it was kind of invisibilized. But for my generation, there are millions of people who can never afford a house, an apartment, or any kind of property because real estate prices have gone through the roof and continue to rise year after year, despite the 2008 financial crash. So the reality is that this is a political decision that was made by both of the parties in the United States, that they're going to allow this crisis to continue, a crisis of inequality that has led to other social problems and health problems, public health problems, a rise in homelessness, a rise in depression, a rise in suicides, all because of this extreme poverty and indebtedness, which is related to that.
So basically, you're pointing to the problems within the system. Yet, according to Pew Research, for instance, the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families actually more than doubled from 1989 to 2016. So does it mean that it has always been this way, or it's even designed, capitalism, even designed that society develops with a widening gap? Or what happened in the past few decades that we are seeing the wealth gap doubling? I want to stay with Benjamin here.
Well, my personal view is I would say, yes, that it is an inherent part of the capitalist system, which is why it is necessary to have state intervention to fight inequality, to bring about more equitable policies on behalf of the public. And in the United States, we've seen a complete aversion to any kind of state intervention in the economy on behalf of, working people since the rise of Ronald Reagan and this kind of bipartisan neoliberal economic philosophy that has dominated since the 1980s. And we see this even within the Democratic Party. I mentioned that President Biden has done some lip service to this idea of capital gains tax, but many prominent Democrats have pledged that it's simply not a possibility to be discussed. But this is also an international problem. And I would say that it's a reflection of this economic ideology that not only has become completely hegemonic around the world, but is reinforced by international financial institutions. Especially, we can talk about the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These are institutions that impose these kinds of policies around the world and say that the solution to bring about economic growth, to have efficient allocation of resources, is these kinds of policies that lead to more inequality. In fact, top economists at the IMF have acknowledged that their own policy prescription, the Washington Consensus, known as the structural adjustment programs that they have, mandated around the world, they themselves acknowledge that this led to rising inequality.
David, is your understanding that widening wealth gap and income gap is basically the way capitalism is designed to be, or that's just the way it is? I mean, including in other societies, including in China. We're also talking about widening gap, yes.
I think it depends on details of policies. It's not, we had a much more equal society. We had a much more equal society back in the 60s and 70s in the United States. And that was also a capitalist society. I think details of policy is what really matters. And what we've had in the United States, I'll summarize policies. The Clinton administration gave the Wall Street banks whatever they wanted. So they made a bunch of financial reforms, which gave power to 10 big banks and took away financing from a lot of the lower people, especially small businesses. And then the Bush II administration gave the military industrial intelligence complex whatever they wanted. You know the story there. And then the Obama administration gave the Silicon Valley monopolists whatever they wanted. and failed to enforce antitrust laws. So now we have a highly concentrated system that has a financial system that serves only a few businesses. And so we've taken away the power of many people to build their own lives.
Yeah, not only we're talking about income inequality rising in the United States, it is higher than in any other advanced economies. For instance, among the G7, the United States has the widest inequality.
Yes.
David, help us understand that.
I think it's because of those policies that I've just been talking about. In the European countries, they're much stronger in enforcing antitrust laws, and they also have sort of a fair financial system, I think. We have a highly concentrated banking system in the United States. I also think we've had an elite grow up in the United States, and we're also seeing it in Europe, that basically don't really care about average or poor people. They have lived their lives separated from average people. They may have gone to an elite university and then they go into the government or they go into an elite business position, and they never do the hard work. I've been meeting Chinese mayors recently, and they grow up from the bottom. They work their way up from the bottom. You no longer have to do that in Western countries. You have an unaccountable elite.
Talking about poverty, the U.S. Census Bureau said the poverty rate in 2020 was 11%, according to U.S. standard, and this appears to be only a slight decrease from nearly 13% in 1989. But Benjamin, I want to ask you this last question. Looking into the future, is there any positive sign that the widening gap is being addressed? Because every president coming into office, they campaign on reducing income gap. And Donald Trump wanted to do that. President Biden definitely announced he's doing that. But do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
I see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel in the sense of average people in the United States wanting change, especially the younger generation. We saw in 2020, there was a large uprising against many of these repressive policies of the United States government. So I think that, yes, a lot of people, not only young people, do want change. They do want a government that is willing to challenge inequality, that is willing to challenge these large billionaire oligarchs that have complete control over the US political system. I should point out that there are scientific studies by respected mainstream academics, including a study that was published by a professor at Princeton University, that looked at the impact of the public on decision-making in the US and found that there is negligible impact of the public. That is to say that according to a scientific understanding of the US political system, the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. And a lot of average working people recognize that, and they want that to change. Unfortunately, I don't see either of the two dominant political parties being able or willing to change that, largely because they're funded by many of the same powerful economic interests that benefit from these policies and that have gotten richer over decades of these policies. I should point out as well that studies show that in congressional races in the United States, consistently, every single election, at least 80, sometimes over 90% of the candidates that have more campaign contributions win the race. That is to say that nearly 100% of the time, people running for Congress who have more money win. That is to say, that is not a democracy, that is a plutocracy. And until there are significant systemic changes in the way the United States government is organized, I think that we're not going to see the changes that we need, and those are going to have to start with average people.
Doesn't look like there's anything in the making. Many thanks to Benjamin Norton joining us from Nicaragua and David Blair joining us from Tibet Autonomous Region. Thank you very much.